I'm Corinne Schaefer, and welcome to Create Outside the Box. In this episode, I'm joined by opera director and general director of Bronx Opera, Benjamin Spierman. We'll talk about his journey in the world of opera and take a closer look at our upcoming concert series, American Classics. Together, we'll explore the musical legacies of Kurt Weill, George Gershwin, and Leonard Bernstein, and how each of them helped shape the sound of American music. If you're interested in watching this episode, please visit the Creative Operations YouTube channel under the playlist, Create Outside the Box. Opera Today praised Benjamin Spierman's production of Lucia di Lammermoor for Opera San Jose as riveting stuff and almost faultless in its dramatic shape and emotional impact. Other regional work includes La Bohème for Syracuse Opera, Romeo et Juliette for St. Petersburg Opera, and Turandot for Dayton Opera. The Dayton City paper called it the most intimate, best characterized production I've seen. He currently serves as general director at Bronx Opera, where he's led New York City premiere productions of Kirk Mitchum's The Rivals, Vaughan Williams' The Poisoned Kiss, and the Weber-Mahler collaboration Die Drei Pintos. He is also co-artistic director of the Oswego Opera Theater in upstate New York, where he's directed a trumped-up Mikado, Don Giovanni, and Charles Abeles' The Golden Cage, written during World War II in Oswego's Fort Ontario Emergency Refugee Shelter. He also acted as interim director of operas at Rutgers University in 2022-2023, where he directed Verdi's Falstaff and Massenet's Cendrillon, both winners of National Opera Association prizes. He also led a black box production of Ariadne auf Naxos for the New York City's Del Arte Opera Ensemble, winner of the American Prize for Opera. Since the beginning of 2024, Mr. Spierman has directed a double bill of Rossini's Il Signor Bruschino in his own English version, and Puccini's Gianni Schicchi, as well as an interactive production of Gilbert and Sullivan's Iolante, both for Bronx Opera. Upcoming, he'll also direct Edward Barnes' A Muskrat Lullaby and Mystery on the Docks for Prelude Opera in New York City, and Lady in the Dark for Oswego Opera. Also a performer, he'll appear as Dull and Boyette in Love Slaber's Lost at Lehman College in the Bronx, where he lives with his wife and frequent artistic collaborator, soprano Hannah Spierman. So hello, Benjamin, and welcome to Create Outside the Box.
Great to be here, Corinne. Thank you.
Well, I'm really excited to learn more about you as an artist and as a director, but also to delve into the subject of Creative Operations' next concert series, which is American Classics, the works of Kurt Weill, George Gershwin, and Leonard Bernstein, and their effect on American music. But before we jump into that topic, let's find out a little bit more about you. Now, I know you're a performer, you're a director.
Yep.
You've done a wide range of different productions, whether it's rediscovered works, premieres, your classic standards in the opera repertoire. How do you decide what stories you want to tell as a director?
Well, I think, first of all, telling these stories, the stories that have built, on which opera has been built and musical theater has been built over the years, really comes down to understanding the timelessness of how we as human beings tell stories. And while obviously there have been developments and whether it's in the just historical, political, social, whatever, over the last 500 years, we as a species have changed. We've also not changed that much. We still want to tell stories about family, about love, about loss, about betrayal, about, reconciliation. And if you look through history, that's pretty universal. And so to me, the best stories are the ones which have been able to repurpose the human condition of the last 500 years in a way that makes sense, that both makes sense in whatever era the story is being created, whether it's whatever century or whatever decade or however you want to divide time, but still understand that our stories as human beings are pretty timeless. And so something that's written in 1750 or 1850 or 1950 is still going to resonate with us today because it is still telling stories that, even if the trappings have changed, are familiar to us. That's what I really look for, is the kinds of stories which combine their era and that combine their era with the universality of the human condition, mm-hmm. and really resonate with me both as sort of a history geek and also as someone who lives when I live, mm-hmm. which is now.
And it is interesting because people who might not be opera aficionados or might think of it as an elite art form often forget that when it comes down to those basic story points, family, love, loss, betrayal, mm-hmm. that actually is more accessible than we think. And it's just in the interpretation. And talking about the interpretation, as general director of Bronx Opera, where you direct a lot of the productions, you also direct for Oswego Opera, where you are a co-artistic director. When you're interpreting these stories, whether it's a new work or a standard classic or a rediscovered work, how do you balance in the storytelling of getting this across to today's audience between preserving the history of the piece and sometimes the innovation that's needed to reach today's audiences?
Well, the history of the piece is usually just, it exists, except in particular pieces where you really do have to recreate them, whether it's in English translation or whether it's just even taking a piece apart and putting it back together, as I've been involved with in a couple of situations. But generally speaking, I would say that what I am trying to do is honor the history of the piece, understand. I mean, this is part of the research, I think, that is the job of a director or conductor or choreographer or whatever, or just even a repertoire, in repertoire selection. It's important to, I think, know and understand the original intention of the authors of the piece, the composer, the librettist, the lyricist, whatever, as you are also deciding whether or not you want to do a production which is placed historically when in the period in which the piece was originally written and intended to be, placed, or if as a director, dramaturg, whatever, like in that kind of world, I think, well, in order to tell this story in a way that will really, really hit in the way that it was intended to hit, I need to do some updating. I need to do some creative and respectful. And when I say respectful, I mean respecting the original intention and how the piece was supposed to hit its audience emotionally, and trying to figure out how to make an analogy between what an 1820 audience was going, what was going to affect them and what affects me as a person living in 2025. And if I can take the original, still honor the intent and honor the intentions of the creators of this piece, and manufacture a way to have the emotional impact be on our audience today what it was back then I've done my job, I think. Yeah. And actually, a great example of that, really quickly, was Der Freischütz, because Der Freischütz is a piece which really was in its time was so innovative in the way in which, especially the Wolf's Glen scene, this supernatural scene in which the bad guy convinces the good guy to make a pact and be in league with the devil, and you see all these images, all this imagery that was very specific to Germany 1821. But that imagery is not good, and it was intended to scare the pants off of people back then. And when we did it at Bronx Opera, my intention was to try to find a way to mimic that emotional impact on my audience. And so what we did was we used a lot of film and video in that scene in particular to basically depict what would be in to 1820 audiences the future, and what the devil would do in the 20th century, and things along the lines of obviously the Holocaust or 9/11. What would scare, what scares me, what would, what we did was we tried to take what would scare the 1821 audience and make an analogy to events of the last 100 years that would scare me. And I think it was pretty successful. And I think because I think it did do a pretty good job of getting the emotional impact that Weber intended, but which his imagery would just to us would just seem kind of quaint, interesting, but cute. So trying to make that analogy is really the job that I think we have.
And, in kind of acting as a modern interpreter and translator, as a director, that brings up another point in a previous discussion. I know you're a big proponent of performing opera and translating into English, and you've done many translations yourself, just to make this even more accessible to audiences, that there's just one less barrier. Would you like to discuss why that's important to you and why you're a proponent of that?
Well, I think that what we've been talking about is really removing barriers. And language is the number one barrier. Obviously, titles and the ability to project, and now what the Met does to have the titles on the back of the seat is even a more individual experience, because the observer can control whether there are titles there and what language they're in and all that, which is a great innovation. But I do think that there is something visceral and more immediately reactable to about having the person singing in the language, in your own language. And that I love you isn't something which is projected above the stage. And you're then kind of going through that process of, it's that foreign film process where the actor says the words, they're projected, and then you kind of understand it, but almost like you're reading, you're reading it. It's like you're reading a book. Whereas if the performer is speaking in your language, then that immediately hits you. And when they say "I love you" or "I hate you," the difference between hearing those two obviously opposite emotional phrases, and reading those two emotional phrases, to me, is you can't recreate the direct reaction to your language being spoken or sung to you. And that's really why I think that it's important to, at least in some situations, for some organizations to do opera in the vernacular and not just in translation with titles. Because I just think there's an immediacy to it, and then you understand the timelessness. Again, it's less separated from you. And our constant battle in opera is to maintain what an original audience would have experienced in their own language. And we do all these kinds of things. We're going to do a flash mob. We're going to do multiple little fun videos to try to get people to come. But then when they come, it's still in a foreign language. And I just feel like it's helpful to, again, at least have the opportunity in some places, with some companies, to still experience opera in your own language, especially in comedy. I mean, because you don't want to laugh. I would rather have a laugh as a director from the person and from also the audience watching the stage and listening to the singers than just from looking up and saying, "Oh, that was funny, ha ha ha," like 3 seconds after the singer or actor said or sung the thing. So that's in a nutshell why I feel how I feel about opera in the vernacular. I also think that it helps the singers understand what they're singing about in the foreign language if they've also performed it in their own language.
No, I agree on all of their points. And it's funny because what you're saying is you want the audience to have an immediate visceral reaction to what they're hearing and seeing, versus when you're reading, it's kind of a more removed intellectual reaction, because you're like, I see this. Oh, okay, this is what I see it. I'm identifying. That's not emotional. And I'm not saying that because I've seen it and I've experienced myself where there are parts of opera. Sometimes I see an opera and I might not have every single word that I can understand, but there's a combination between the performance and the music where I have an emotional response, even though it's in a foreign language that I have to decipher. But I do think if we're talking about removing barriers, and as you said, getting the audience to experience it as they did originally, that translating it to whatever the native language is of the audience is a way to just really get that response and break down those barriers.
Yeah, and real quickly, I think another thing is that obviously in the classic operas, a lot of text is repeated over and over again. And I really think that the reason that was done is because, as you said, we're not going to understand every syllable and every word, especially when an orchestra is playing. That once you've said, I want to go, I want to go, I want to go 15 times. By the 15th time, people know you said, I want to go.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of why that tradition exists in opera and even in musical theater too, to an extent.
Mm-hmm. In talking about productions, you have worked with productions in small black box theaters, grand opera houses. How do you go about creating, directing, and telling a story based on the space that you're working in?
Well, I think that there's a formality to the proscenium theater, which is, many, 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 many hundreds of years old, which lends itself with an orchestra in front and the singers or the actors, on the stage, where you are kind of presenting the equivalent of a live, what now would be a live movie, where everything is a little bit two-dimensional. Obviously, there's depth, and there's depth to the experience. Visually, there's depth to the experience. And when I direct in those kinds of spaces and in those kinds of situations, it's a little bit different because you do want it is more important that you honor the audience's perspective, which is to say, in front of all of the singers or actors. The actors are going this way, the audience is going this way, and it's kind of a back and forth in that literal sense. Whereas when I've gotten to work in black boxes or any kind of found space or different locations, and the entrances and exits of the characters are coming either through the audience or around the audience in some way, that creates a different kind of more three-dimensional experience. And one of the things that's happened with Bronx Opera in the last couple of years, including this Così that we're putting up this weekend, is that we've had the orchestra upstage of most of the singers in action. So the orchestra's behind the singers. Or sometimes the singers walk around the orchestra, and sometimes the singers are in the audience itself. And it sort of breaks down even just having an audience member who's looking in front of them, and then suddenly, hey, there's something going on behind me, or hey, there's something going on to my right, changes people's experience of the art form and of whatever story is being told. They're more part of it. I mean, the word immersive is thrown around a lot, but that's literally what it is. So when I'm in larger spaces where we're going to have that kind of one-to-one forward and backwards experience, it's a little bit more of, again, it's not quite film directing, but it's got more in common with it, I guess I would say. Because in film, you don't expect, suddenly, Timothy Chalamet is behind you. No, that's not how that's going to work. Yeah. Whereas in some of the productions I do, Timothy Chalamet is in fact walking down the aisle next to you and walking past you. So the space really does, I think, determine a lot of how the piece wants to be done. And also the piece itself determines that and how it lends itself to these different configurations.
No, I completely agree. And I do think some of the more traditional, larger spaces are also rethinking that. recent production of The Magic Flute at the Met, for example, you've got a Foley artist on one side and you've got an animator on the other side, which is already kind of taking the audience off of what is only happening on stage. And then they have characters coming in and out of the Met auditorium. You have the lights on without an official formal start for the conductor orchestra. So even in arguably the most traditional opera house in the United States, we're starting to break down some of these. This is what you do here. This is what's expected, which when executed well is extremely exciting for both the performers, the musicians, anyone involved with the production, but also for the audience. And that's what we want to cultivate, is that relationship and excitement with the audience.
Exactly.
So you wear many, many hats. You're also a performer. How does that relationship, what is that relationship with being a performer and then carrying that over as a director?
Oh, for me, it's just invaluable to still. I mean, I started out as a performer, as an actor, and then moved into singing and into musical theater and Gilbert and Sullivan. And there came a point where I really became, as I used to say, 95% a director. And a very kind friend said he's 100% of everything, which was one of the great compliments of my life. But I think still performing just reminds me that the challenges that the performer has and that the director has and that the producer has, and I've stage managed a bunch, and we all have literally a role to play. And as a performer, I admit that it is hard for me to be directed by most other people. It is, and as I have developed as a director and developed to having my own concepts of things, performing for other people has become harder, which is one of the reasons I try to do it as much as possible. But performing informs my directing, and my directing informs my performing. But certainly as a performer, when I perform, I'm constantly reminded that there's a certain kind of ego, in a good way, that a performer needs to have in order to really project the personality, sing the music, speak the words, whatever, and really communicate. That is different than how a director operates. And the ability and the understanding of both perspectives, I think, has really helped me do both. And certainly performing helps my directing. I would not want to stop performing. And when I don't perform for a while and then I go back to it, I remember why I wanted to do it in the first place.
Yeah, I think sometimes people don't, we get stuck in our little, boxes and our little thing, like this is what we do. And sometimes, putting on another hat not only gives us a greater appreciation for what it takes to create something, but as you said, it really informs you of the process. And maybe you have a better understanding for your performers. You have a better understanding when you are a performer and you have a director of where that person is, and it builds your empathy. And empathy is definitely something we need as artists to create.
For sure. I also wanted to just quickly say that I was in a production of Love's Labor's Lost at Lehman College outdoors last summer, early fall. And one of the amazing things was that we had a cast of, I think 10 actors. None of us did only one thing. Everybody. And almost all of them were 20, 30 years younger than me. And I think that the younger generation is now, honestly, partially for economic reasons, needing to be able to perform and direct and work in media and, post your own, whether it's TikTok or YouTube or whatever. Nobody just acts or sings or directs anymore. Everybody is a multi-phased artist. So I think and you're seeing that increasingly. So honestly, to compete, and to succeed as a performer, to make, frankly, any money at all, you're going to really have to be able to do a lot of different things. And for me, that's a good thing because that's kind of what I've always tried to do. But really, it was amazing. None of it, everybody had credits in multiple different disciplines, and it was cool. And I think it made everybody work better as actors.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So in kind of getting just a slight taste of your background and your experience and some of your views on opera and directing, and again, just a small taste, but we've hit on, accessibility. We've hit on breaking down barriers and, language and how that affects an audience taking something in. And that kind of segues very nicely into our next topic, which are these three iconic composers, Kurt Weill, George Gershwin, and Leonard Bernstein. And they fit really well because these three composers really had no genre. I mean, they crossed every boundary, they blurred every line, composing for classical, opera, musical theater, pop. Can you go into a little bit of their impact and what that impact was then, but also how it still influences opera today?
Well, I think, first of all, just the pieces that those three created. I mean, obviously, Porgy and Bess has been incredibly influential. And the musicals that Gershwin wrote, especially obviously with his brother Ira and other collaborators, really just kind of took the concept of musical theater and what that even was in the 1920s, and then Showboat changed everything. And then Gershwin went to Hollywood, but then he still kept a foot in Broadway, and then Porgy and Bess, which I think we'll probably touch on, that these operas were first seen on Broadway, and that the difference between Broadway and the opera stage just wasn't that great. I mean, really, Broadway was kind of the equivalent of our folks opera. It was really what that was. It was not this huge separation. So obviously Gershwin, just in the songs he wrote, in the musicals of the I Sing, is an incredibly important American. I think it was the first musical to win a Pulitzer. I might be wrong about that. And then that leading to more musicals and more immortal music, and then Porgy and Bess just really, I think it pushed the concept of what opera was, and who could sing it. I mean, obviously, the African-American cast of Porgy and Bess, just, the existence of a cast like that was a major change, not the ultimate change, but it started, kind of bringing in certain things into the mainstream. And then you had Gershwin's unfortunate death, and not getting the chance to really revise Porgy and Bess, which I think they probably would have done. That was obviously a great tragedy. However, what Gershwin started really continued with people like Bernstein, and obviously Bernstein with his sort of contemporaries like Copland and Blitzstein and David Diamond and people like that, who really brought the concept of what classical music was and what opera was into a more mixed genre, where jazz and other dance forms, American dance forms like the cakewalk or whatever, were really brought into what Americans were producing. And Bernstein, of course, was a really important figure, both as a composer, but also as a conductor and as an educator, to really in bringing the concept of classical music and translating it in a way that was accessible to people just as a thing to talk about. It wasn't something that you needed to have 5 degrees and be wearing a tuxedo in order to talk about, or a gown. You could talk about it just, in a way that was somewhat vernacular. And Weill is, of course, just such a fascinating figure, coming over from Hitler Europe, escaping and bringing his style, which over there was more astringent, to Broadway, and melding it more with a kind of a lyrical Broadway style, but I think never really losing that astringency. And when you put these guys together, when you put what they did together, even just between like 1935 and 1960, around when Porgy and Bess was written, and all the way through the works of Weill and his unfortunate early death, another loss at 50 years old. And then you expand that to what Bernstein did with whether it was Trouble in Tahiti or whether it was Candide, or obviously West Side Story, which, I mean, again, was this incredibly critical work to the development of how we listen to music, both in the Broadway theater and on the opera stage. And then Candide sort of jumping from the Broadway house to opera, and of course the multiple versions of Candide, and how that all kind of got sculpted over Bernstein's life. You take these three people and others that were their contemporaries, and they really understood that music is music and storytelling is storytelling, and you can't and you shouldn't just divide it into this stage, and there's a space between them. The space between them is what we all try, I think, to bridge. And there really haven't been more important bridge builders than the three people that you're talking about here, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting because from what I studied and what I've read about these men, they weren't sitting there going, I'm going to write something that's accessible. I'm going to write something that's popular. They weren't goal driven in that way. If you look at the three of them, they were three men, three composers who loved music
Mm-hmm.
and were curious. And it was always about what's next? What can I play with? They just always stayed mercurial, and they didn't want to get stuck in one sound. And sometimes that was, frustrating because they'd have a big success. And then I think people would always want them to compose that way. And they were like, oh, I want to grow, And so that maybe sometimes was frustrating, but they still managed to keep changing. And I mean, to me, out of the three, and I think with poor Gershwin, it was because he passed away just so early. Who knows what that music would have evolved as he evolved? But I do think that he laid a foundation for a lot of American composers. I know Weill was at a performance of Porgy and Bess, that those two men did meet each other. I know when Weill, first immigrated to the United States, like so many composers from Europe did at that time, they went to Hollywood. They were composing in film. You had composers like Korngold composing for film, and they were like little sponges. And I know Weill, like he came over and he was looking at Gershwin and the brothers, Ira Gershwin, George Gershwin, looking at their movies with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, and kind of going, what can I learn from this, and just evolving their style. But again, my long rant is that they weren't sitting there going, I want to make something popular. They were just like, let's just create. And I think sometimes nowadays we're so focused on the result instead of the process that we're missing the forest through the trees, and there's something to be learned by people that were just always playful and always curious, and they got the results that we wanted.
Yeah, they wrote what was in their minds, and because, as you say, they were such sponges. What was in their mind was this and that. This piece of, is this jazz, or is this classical, or is this a dance form, or is this whatever? And they maybe weren't, as you're saying, as conscious of innovating. They just were innovators. And yeah, obviously there's a tremendous drive from outside of you to write more of what you just wrote. I mean, I kind of go back to, I think Beethoven told Rossini to write more Barbieris. And Rossini not to bring a completely disparate person into this, was always growing really through his compositional life until he stopped writing. But like, I think you really do see this force that is exerted on someone once they've had a huge success to repeat that success. But one of the reasons that they had the success was because they didn't repeat themselves. They learned from their own work and also from works of others. And obviously, I think I've always been fascinated by the fact that I think the only collaborator Ira Gershwin ever had other than his brother was Kurt Weill in Lady in the Dark, and I think in Love Life, but I might be getting that. But I know they collaborated at least once. I mean, obviously Lady, but twice. And Ira was not on Broadway at that time. He was in Hollywood, really. But he very specifically collaborated with Weill, and I think that underlines how important Gershwin, Weill, and then Bernstein were to really everything that we still see in music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
in American music.
Yeah, I think they collaborated at least twice. I know it was more than
at
one.
least twice. Yeah.
And yeah, there's this kind of lineage, and connection with all three composers. You already started bringing up my next question, which I think is really fascinating. Is, as you said, Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, Kurt Weill's American opera street scene, and of course Leonard Bernstein's Candide. A lot of these works we see in opera houses now, but they premiered on Broadway. And I wanted to kind of discuss why that happened, what was radical about that happening, and did that make a difference for audiences?
Well, I think first of all that what was radical about it is that it wasn't radical at all. You've mentioned these three. I would even add like The Consul by Menotti also premiered on Broadway. The Medium and The Telephone, going back into the 30s, Douglas Moore's The Devil and Daniel Webster premiered on Broadway. There just wasn't that divide. And partially, I mean, honestly, miking changed everything. Miking on Broadway changed everything. When, at a certain point in 1950, if you went to a Broadway musical and you went to an opera, the natural human voice was what was being sent your way in all those venues. Once miking became how Broadway expressed music, that really, an opera, I mean, there's occasional miking in opera that we don't want to admit to, but basically opera is still a natural, unvarnished, point-to-point orchestra and singers projecting art form, whereas Broadway is a little more of an engineered art form. So I think now when you see things like Baz Luhrmann's Bohème, that was really kind of an incredible thing to and rare it by that time to see an opera with singers who could bridge that gap on Broadway was a huge change and a huge difference for audiences by the time that was on Broadway. But for an audience in 1950, I mean, you go to the Met or City Opera, or you'd go to whatever you go to around the country, and then you'd go to a Broadway show, and really, it was a matter of style and maybe an emphasis on choreography in a particular way, but I think that the radical nature of it was that it wasn't radical. It was we went to a show and we went to another show. And the separation is something that the generation, the future, that generations after the 50s into the 60s and 70s really created. And now we have this division. And I don't think that when these three brilliant individuals were writing, the separation just wasn't as great. Maybe it was the size of the theater was smaller on Broadway. Maybe you'd have 1,000 seats as opposed to 3,000 or whatever, but it just wasn't, the differences just weren't that prevalent yet. I mean, Ezio Pinza could end a career as a great opera singer and then do South Pacific and Fanny, but and other people did the same thing, went back and forth somewhat. Whereas I think now, although modern singers are able to do it, it is a much it is a much harder thing to bridge that gap.
Mm-hmm. And it was interesting because there was just a snippet of a conversation that I saw with Patti LuPone and George
Mm-hmm.
Clooney, who are both currently on Broadway right now, talking about how Patti LuPone brings up how these productions they're over mic'd now, that the sound is just way too loud. And I have a friend performing in Europe, same thing. Like the productions are way loud. It's like just to engulf the audience in sound. But what Patti LuPone brought up, which I think is so important, not only to Broadway, but in opera as an art form, is that we're supposed to bring the sound to bring the audience in. We want them to lean into what we're doing. And if it's just this bombardment of, everybody's mic just being turned up at 110,
Right.
it changes the interaction between audience member and performer.
Yeah, there's also a matter of theatrical acoustics, and I don't think the new theaters are built with those kinds with that in mind. They're not built as much with the natural sound in mind. They're built with the understanding that if you do a Broadway show, it's going to be an engineered thing. The star, in some ways, exaggeration, but the star of a Broadway show is ultimately a person nobody sees, which is the person who is managing or designing the sound in the moment. And having done some opera where everything is mic'd, outdoor performances primarily, the engineer really becomes the that is the person that really makes the show happen in a way that the audience truly experiences. It's how is the sound mixed, and that's something that obviously in when you go back to when Gershwin and Weill and Bernstein were writing primarily, although Bernstein did bridge the gap, they weren't sound design. What was that?
Exactly.
Sound design was the composer was the sound designer,
Mm-hmm.
and the orchestrator was the sound designer. Whereas now there's so many more people that you see. Obviously, the design of the show and the spectacular Phantom of the Opera, Les Mis, where so much of the design, the visual is a huge thing. The sound has to match that, and it does take away that person to person intimacy that we still, for the most part, do have in opera.
Exactly. Going back to the fact that, at that time, it wasn't so rare to see opera on Broadway. In doing some reading, and by no means am I an expert, but it seemed also at that time that when people thought of opera in opera houses, they were thinking it had to be Verdi, Puccini, Rossini. They were thinking American. And in a sense, people like Menotti, like Gershwin, like Weill could be more experimental on a Broadway stage because it was like, well, the opera houses, they're doing all of this stuff. We want to do something new. New is happening on Broadway. And that maybe gave them more freedom, I would argue, than someone today who maybe gets a large commission at the Met or at Houston Grand Opera, and they feel this pressure to immediately have something that's going to go into the operatic canon, to be performed. Right. Versus something, it's like, we're doing it on Broadway, let's see how it goes. And then maybe it becomes like Porgy and Bess, an evergreen that's done every year. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I think you make a good point. I think that if a composer today wants to do something experimental, there are places to do it, but Broadway is not the place for someone who's going to write what we would call classical music. Let's say analog music that's going to be, well, there obviously are combinations of recorded sound with live sound, but basically, if you're going to be an experimental classical composer and you're going to write an opera, Broadway's not where it's going to go. It's going to go to a small company. It's going to go to a workshopping place. American Opera Projects, for example, is a place where, works are workshopped and developed. wonderful company, Encompass Opera, New Opera Theater, which exists to take these new pieces and put them together. Bronx Opera hasn't done much of that, but I'm hoping that we will in the future, where it's companies like ours that are part of like what Bronx Opera is part of the New York Opera Alliance, which is a combination of like 30 or so companies in New York City that all work in different kinds of ways and different sizes and shapes. And that's really where our companies, not just in New York, but around the country, are the kinds of places where you'd see these kinds of experimental work that tells different stories, which may end up being operatic, like some of the stuff you're seeing at the Met, the Terence Blanchard operas and things like that. I think you can still be experimental, but Broadway's not where you're going to go with it.
No.
Not that there is not experimental Broadway, but it's a different thing. And I really do think that the question is how important is the sound engineer and the mixer in what the product is going to be. And the less important that person is, I think, the more likely that work is to be an opera.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the difference now between opera and musical theater. But again, I don't want to even really get into there being a divide, because I don't think there should be. However, there just naturally is. And how important the sound engineer is really kind of, I think, where the divide comes. So you can still experiment, but but Broadway's not where a classical composer is going to go to do that experiment.
No, not now. No, I agree with you on all of that.
Whereas these, obviously, I mean, Candide is tremendous. I mean, just the disparate elements and the musical styles, and obviously Weill, who wrote things like Street Scene, but he also wrote. I mean, Lady in the Dark is not an opera.
No.
But it is an analog piece, and it is a big band kind of it's like big band combined with a 1940 play.
Mm-hmm.
Hal Joey by Rodgers and Hart, different kind of piece, more experimental in the way that they were telling those stories. I mean, Lady in the Dark, the central issue there is psychoanalysis, which you don't write about that. Al Joey, I know we weren't talking about Rodgers, but like the hero is a heel.
Yeah.
So how do you even go there and work from that? But yeah, the experimentation is so important in the arts, no matter what. I mean, that's visual art, literary, stage, theater, music, whatever. You've got to keep experimenting and inventing it, reinventing what you're doing, and not just trying to repeat what you did. And that's, I think, what these three brilliant people were able to do, was understand their own history and the history of their art form, but not try to repeat it all the time.
No, I agree. And in talking about experimentation, Gershwin might not have been the absolute first, but he was the first to make it famous, was his collaboration of classical and jazz.
Oh, God, yeah.
And I just wanted to get in, like, what that kind of said about what was happening in the world at that time, and how really groundbreaking it was.
Yeah, I think if you listen to An American in Paris, you will understand that the world was changing, and technology and the way we traveled, the importance of the automobile, the importance of the train had already been, but like the car being such an important part of how people traveled, and expressing that part of life through music. I mean, but if you go back to, like, for example, Puccini and Il Tabarro, in the intro to Il Tabarro, he is trying to bring the atmosphere of the Paris dock into this classically Puccinian piece. And so the great innovators in Puccini was, and then Gershwin, and you forget that Puccini and Gershwin were alive at the same time. And Gershwin was also experiencing having been playing songs for Tin Pan Alley. And so when he wrote American Paris, and when he wrote Rhapsody in Blue, and he wrote the Concerto in F, he was also writing musicals at the same time. So the same brain was doing this and doing that. And so, as I think we're making the point that doing this and doing that meant you were doing all of it. And it was one mind, an amazing mind, but one mind. And I think that the experimentation and bringing modern life into classical music was something that Gershwin really did. He certainly made it popular. Other people were doing it, but he made it more, he made it kind of, he bridged the gap.
Definitely. And now shifting over to Weill, who knew Gershwin. Yeah. We said earlier in the conversation, Weill was born in Germany. He had to flee at that time with the rise of Hitler. And he came over to the United States. And even though he was born German, he became an American citizen, and he considered himself an American composer. And I think Weill's musical works, to me, are the most diverse. I mean, if you listen to what he composed in Germany, and then you hear the evolution once he came to the United States. And when he came to America, he really was a sponge, and he really adapted his style to reflect where he was and what was going on. He always, in my opinion, retained what was Weill and his sophistication and his outlook. But I just find it fascinating how he adapted. And how do you think he was so successful in resonating with American audiences, with American music, as a foreigner who had to come and really shift things up in this country?
Well, I think he understood what his audiences were going to want in the U.S., especially post World War II. But really, even, I guess I should say, during World War II and post World War II, but between when he got here and when he died in 1950, he understood that the audience in the Broadway audience was different than his Weimar Republic audience had been. He still retained a certain subversive character, which is one of the things I love about him the most. I mean, he telling the story of street scene and the location in which street scene takes place. I mean, that's kind of subversive for its time, to really just be on a New York City street and tell that story in that place. And again, as I was mentioning with Lady in the Dark, psychoanalysis as a central factor. So the subversiveness remained, but the musical style, I think he heard what was around him. He heard the works of Gershwin, the works of Rogers, the works of Corinne, and he allowed his surroundings to affect him in a good way. He allowed where he was and who he was going to be working with, who were the singers he'd be working with, what were the forces he would have, what was the sound, again, that of whether it was jazz or just getting into like the Glenn Miller feel of it all, and understanding, and Benny Goodman, and understanding that these things were around him, and he was not going to try to be 100% different. He was still going to be himself, but he was going to be himself in a new place. And I think that's a tremendously exciting thing to do, a tremendous challenge as an artist that obviously he accepted. And if people criticized him for not being true to himself, I guess, honestly, who is to tell a person that they're true to themselves or not? I mean, he wrote what he wrote. He wrote what was in his mind. And I think that's what all three of these composers did. And I think this comes back to what you said at the beginning, which is they weren't really consciously innovating. They were living. They were living, and they were musicians, and they were composers, and what they heard and experienced classically in terms of jazz, in terms of musical theater, was what they expressed, especially when inspired by a story and by the particular lyrics of the people that wrote with them, which again brings me back to Weill writing with Ira Gershwin, which kind of puts it in some ways all together for me.
No, I agree with everything. Coming back to accessibility, Bernstein I mean, I don't know that man just had so much energy. I mean, as a
Mm,
conductor, as a composer, and then he was a huge proponent of outreach,
yeah.
having the televised young people's concerts and just introducing opera and classical music to younger generations. And as you were saying, making it something that you could just have a discussion. Like we're having a discussion right now. You
Right.
didn't have to be elite. You didn't have to be, in a tuxedo or a gown. You could just talk about it. Why was that? I just feel like at that time it was groundbreaking. But at the same time, I feel like in 2025, we can learn from what Bernstein was doing.
Yeah, I think the key is always to just talk about what you do as both something that does have a universality to it, but is also just what you do. It's I love to talk about sports, talk about it all the time with many people, but I don't have to feel like I need 5 degrees in order to talk about it. But I do feel that there is this sense that talking about classical music or opera requires a, you know, credits, um, an accreditation of some kind. And I think the first thing, and obviously Bernstein had all that. He had all the credits you could ever want, classically in terms of Broadway, educationally, every imaginable thing. But what he did was he just talked to people, and he didn't talk down to them, and he talked about this thing that he loved, that he did, that coursed through his veins, and he was able to converse and express himself in a way that people just understood that this was something that could be done by anyone really, and could be loved by anyone. You don't have to know how to play an instrument or sing or read music to love and appreciate a performance of an opera or or a musical piece or whatever. You don't have to have credits to enjoy the piece, to enjoy watching something. Broadway, Shakespeare, whatever. It doesn't. You just have to be a person, be a human being, and relate to what you're seeing. And Bernstein was great at being the person on the other end who could express what was being seen and heard in a way that made it okay for people to listen to it, watch it, and love it.
No, I agree because I think a lot of what acts as a barrier between people and the classical arts, I would put ballet in there, I would put some fine art in there, is that
For
people,
sure.
no one likes to feel stupid, you
Right.
know?
Oh God, yeah.
And if you feel like just by entering the room that you're like, oh, I feel stupid, I feel like and part of that is on those of us who love these art forms to create a warm environment like Leonard Bernstein did, where it's more like, hi, come on in, welcome to my
Right.
house. Let me share this meal. Or, like if you invite people over to your home, you're like, oh, let me just share something that I created, meal or whatever, and enjoy
Yeah.
it. And our meal, our nourishment is the art, and it's
Yep.
about sharing that. It's not about, do you have a degree to discuss this? Do you have the right entrance fee? So,
Right.
as you said, Bernstein was very good at just talking about something he loved and not being condescending and just sharing. And I think we can all learn from that. All three of these composers, I mean, again, there's so much overlap between them and their works, but they all wrote pieces that dealt with race, equity, social issues, politics. They just, in their own ways, were just underscoring, human life and what was going on in
Yeah.
society. Um, in 2025, how do these resonate? And you, as a director, how would you stage these? Again, there's been some time between when they first premiered and now, but I feel like they're still relevant.
Well, yeah, I think unfortunately, I know we're not talking about this composer, but Menotti's The Consul has been dated, modern, dated, and unfortunately, I think now we're seeing very topical, you know, political imprisonment and how immigration is handled, is really kind of at this and subversiveness and being a member of a resistance in a place where that is not welcomed and escaping a country and getting the support or lack that. I mean, it's The Consul is frighteningly timely. And I think it's a good example of how, first of all, the human condition doesn't really change, and that's not always a good thing. The arc of justice does bend in, well, I don't know how it's bending now. I'm not sure that we can really understand how it's bending now. But so in terms of staging the works of these particular composers, I think there are times when updating a story is really important to be able to expressing it to modern audiences. But then I think there's a point where you just have to take a look at the work and stage it as it was originally intended to be staged by its creators, and let the audience do the work. Let the audience sit there and say, yeah, okay, well, there's parts of Candide that I'm now understanding in a different way as we sit here in 2025. There's parts of Street Scene is actually a great example, or Knickerbocker Holiday, which was about the founding of New York City, but had a Roosevelt as a character in it. How do I take that and relate it to what I am experiencing when I walk out of the theater? People go to the theater for different reasons. A lot of times people do not go to the theater to see something that reflects what's going on in their life outside the theater. But once they see the play or see the opera or the musical or whatever word you want to put on it, and they leave, they're back. They are both carrying what they saw in the theater. They're carrying what they saw in the theater, but they're also experiencing their actual life. And how that goes together is something that, again, each audience member decides for themselves, or not even decides, just experiences for themselves. So I think that the question of how I would stage these works is that is always an individual thing when I start a production. But I think that they should just, today I might just look at them and say, okay, audience members, here's what we're going to do. I'll give you a little bit of example that isn't about these three composers, if that's all right. I'm about to do La Clemenza di Tito with our mutual friend Chris Fecto, and at a Del Arte Opera Ensemble. And that is an opera which is so much about a lead character, a dictator, who chooses mercy over revenge. Okay, now I don't have to even talk about why that's timely. In our production, in our imagination, we're going to place it in Rome if Rome had continued as a modern nation state and still existed in 2025. What would it look like? How would it be? Who would Tito be? And how would he relate to the other characters in the play? Well, the original time frame of that story is 89 AD, but nothing's really changed. So I guess that what I tend to do is a combination of traditional, but also putting a twist on the tradition and saying, well, and having an intimation to an audience that, yeah, what went on in 1930 or 50 or when Mozart wrote Clemenza in 1791 is still with us, and not talking down to your audience means not needing to force feed them every little detail of why you should think this is relevant. Mm-hmm. Come to our show, see it, experience it, go out and say, wow, that was relevant. And I think that's part of the job of not being condescending, is to respect your audience enough to say, you can figure this out. You know what I'm doing. Without necessarily, again, spoon feeding every detail.
Exactly. And I think sometimes, I've definitely gone to see things or certain productions that maybe it wouldn't have been my choice or I don't love everything about it, or maybe I don't agree with everything about it, but it makes me think. And I think sometimes, even if you have varying opinions, just watching something and thinking about it, and how does that apply to my worldview? Where do I fit in with this? That's also what art does. You don't have to leave a show all the time with a clear beginning, middle, end. Here's the resolution. Sometimes
Right.
leaving a show with a question mark and going, what does this make me think about? What resonates with me? What doesn't resonate with me? What gave me an emotional impact that maybe I wasn't expecting? Going out with friends after the show and discussing it. That's the power of art. So, I'm just saying, in talking about not being condescending and not having to spoon feed audiences, which I agree with, is also, don't expect to have to tie everything up in a little bow for your audience, and that sometimes having those question marks, and sometimes as audience members, stretching ourselves and exposing ourselves to things that are different, helps us to grow. And I think that's why the arts can be so important to our society, because they serve as a reflection of what's going on. And sometimes we might not like what we see in the mirror, but it's still there. And we have to see how that fits in with our narrative of our life.
Yeah, and I think that we're coming close to wrapping up, but I think that I would say that what you're describing is what these three composers were so good at, was taking what they saw and heard and relating it to what they had learned, and synthesizing it into something that an audience would experience and take home, and then maybe have these conversations. And that's what art does. I mean, Picasso's Guernica tells a very specific story. I know it's jerked into visual arts, but a very specific story about a very specific time in a very specific place, but it is also universal and timeless. And that's what I think these composers were able to do in their art form.
Exactly. As we wrap up, are there any composers right now that are the contemporary Weill, Gershwin, and Bernstein?
Well, I want to give a shout out to Steve Wallace. Steve Wallace is a person I met as a singer who sang with Bronx Opera a few times, and including as Tito in Clemenza a couple of years ago. And Steve and his librettist partner Kenny Harmon have been working on a Count of Monte Cristo opera, which Bronx Opera is planning to do in the next couple of years. And what they've managed to do, and this opera is kind of, if you can imagine, a bel canto opera over hip hop beat, basically, to simplify it, and telling the story, a story written by Dumas, who was a person of color, and writing that story as two African American men in 2025, and synthesizing that, all of their experience with interpreting Dumas with this particular story, which is so well known and timeless. Steve does a lot of the kind of work that these three composers did in terms of experiencing what he's experienced, his knowledge as a singer. He's a really good tenor. His knowledge as a composer, his knowledge just in his life, which also relates to Kenny's experience as a writer and also as a singer. I think that Steve is the kind of person, and there are many examples of this today. I think we're in potentially a golden age, where you have a lot of people who have kind of come back to combining all of their experiences into what they write. And that's I think really what Gershwin and Bernstein and Weill did, and it's what I see in how Steve writes and how other people write as well. But in terms of my own what's in front of me, Steve Wallace is really the kind of artist that embodies what it is we're talking about.
Okay, well, we'll have to check that out. And speaking of you and upcoming things, we know La Clemenza di Tito is coming in June. What are your upcoming projects that we can look out for? And if people want to learn more about you, Bronx Opera, Oswego Opera, just anything that you're involved in, where should they look to find information?
You can look at benjaminspierman.com. I really need to update it. You can look at bronxopera.org for what Bronx Opera is doing. We're doing Così fan tutte the 26th weekends of the 26th of April and the 3rd of May. So this might not be. We might be talking about something that already happened by the time we're watching this video. But yeah, Clemenza is the 16th. Yeah, no, the 18th, 20th, and 22nd of June at the Art New York Mezzanine Theater in Manhattan. After that, I'm not sure. You know how we are these days. Everything's kind of moment by moment a little bit. But other things will come up. I also work with an opera company in New York called the Prelude Opera that does operas for children.
Oh, nice.
And we're doing a shortened Hansel and Gretel in the fall, mostly in Upper Manhattan. So there are always things that come around. We'll see what performing holds for me and what directing holds and what Bronx Opera is going to do. Bronx Opera is in kind of a state of transition and right now, but transition in a way that I think will be very positive. But I think reinventing yourself a little bit is what we're talking about today. And that's what I try to do as a director and performer and producer. And that's what our company does. And, I don't know what's coming up after in 2026, but I will say it's going to be fun. And I know that.
Exactly. And I think there's a lot of us, as you said, in the same boat, and maybe it's not a bad boat to be in, right?
Yeah, it's all right.
Yeah. So this is actually coming out the first Friday in May, which means that will be the last weekend of Così fan tutte. So if you are watching this as it debuts Friday, try and grab some last minute tickets to see Così fan tutte.
Come to Lehman College tomorrow and Sunday.
Yes, exactly.
7:30 in the evening on the 3rd and 2:30 in the afternoon on the 4th.
Exactly. So try and get those tickets. It'll be great. And then keeping with the Mozart theme, then come out to see La Clemenza di Tito with Del Arte Opera Ensemble. It will be a production you don't want to miss. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, I know you're super, super busy, so I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today.
Really great to talk to you, Corinne. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. It was fun.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Create Outside the Box. Please subscribe, rate, and share our podcast. You can listen to Create Outside the Box on Spotify, Buzzsprout, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. Check us out on our Creative Operations YouTube channel, where you can subscribe to watch our interviews. You can find and follow Creative Operations on our Facebook page and on Instagram at @CO_Creative Operations. For more information about Creative Operations, please visit www.creative-operations.org.